Most fairy tales begin with love. Clara's began with a bargain. On her wedding day, she was handed to Julian, Lord Blackwood, like the final answer to a problem neither of them wanted. She was the Duke's difficult daughter. He was a lord drowning in debt, and neither expected tenderness. But in a house built on duty and silence, one strange marriage was about to become something far more dangerous and far more beautiful. The church smelled like candle wax and cold stone, and Clara thought that was fitting, because she felt cold too, cold all the way down to her slippers, even though the room was full of people, and the priest was saying words that would tie her to a man she had met exactly twice. Rows of candles lined the stone walls, and she could feel the watchful eyes of the congregation on the back of her neck, like a physical weight. Guests who had come, she suspected, more out of curiosity than affection. She was 31 years old. In her world, that made her old for a bride. Most women her age were already deep into motherhood, already settled, already folded neatly into someone else's house. Clara had never folded neatly into anything. She was the daughter of a duke, but she had spent her 20s with dirt under her fingernails and ink smudged on the side of her hand, filling ledger after ledger with notes on crop rotation and soil acidity, and the strange, stubborn way that certain medicinal herbs refused to grow unless you understood exactly what they wanted. Her father called her difficult. Her mother had stopped trying to change her years ago. The women at parties called her, behind careful fans, the Duke's odd daughter. And Clara had decided long ago that she would rather be odd and useful than pleasant and empty. Now she was standing at an altar, about to become the wife of a man named Julian, Lord Blackwood. She had heard things about him before she ever saw his face, that he was sharp-tongued, that he ran his estate with a strictness that made his staff flinch, that he had buried both of his parents within 2 years of each other, and had not smiled properly since, that his family's land, once grand, was now buried under debts so heavy that the roof of the east wing had not been repaired in 3 years, because there was simply no money to spare. Some of the older ladies at her father's dinner table had lowered their voices when they spoke of him, as though even his misfortune deserved discretion. That was the truth of it, really. This wedding was not about love, it was about numbers. Julian needed a wife whose dowry could save his estate, and Clara's father, tired of a daughter who would not marry for status or charm, or any of the reasons a proper young lady was supposed to marry, had offered a dowry so large that it made the arrangement impossible to refuse. Clara had agreed to it herself, in the end, not because she wanted a husband, but because she understood arithmetic, and she understood that a stubborn, sharp-tongued lord with a crumbling estate might, at the very least, leave her alone to do her work. She had not expected to feel this nervous. When she finally lifted her eyes to look at him properly, standing there in the candlelight with his dark coat and his unreadable face, she felt something twist in her chest that she did not have a name for. He was younger than she had pictured, and harder to read than any ledger she had ever balanced. His eyes were the kind of gray that did not give anything away. The vows were said. The ring was placed on her finger, cold and heavy and strange, engraved on the inside with initials that were not yet hers to recognize. And then it was over, and she was his wife, and there was a long carriage ride ahead of her, toward a home she had never seen. The carriage was dark inside, lit only by the thin light that slipped through the curtains as the horses pulled them away from the church and out onto the long road toward the Blackwood estate. Clara sat stiffly on her side of the seat, her hands folded in her lap, very aware of the man sitting across from her, his long legs stretched out, his face turned toward the window. She did not like silence when it stretched too long. Silence, in her experience, usually meant someone was waiting to say something unkind, and she preferred to say the unkind thing first, on her own terms, so that at least she was the one who chose the words. "I hope you got a fair price for me," she said, into the quiet. "I understand prize mares fetch quite a bit these days, especially ones that come with a full dowry and no complaints." She expected silence, or perhaps a cold reprimand about a lady's manners. She braced herself for it. Instead, Julian turned his head slowly from the window, and in the dim light, she saw the corner of his mouth lift, just slightly, in something that was almost a smile. "A prize mare," he said, "would have come with better manners and considerably less commentary. I believe I was sold a difficult mule, dressed in silk." Clara blinked. Then, before she could stop it, a short laugh escaped her, surprised out of her chest. "A mule!" she repeated. "How generous of you." "Mules are far more useful than mares," Julian said, and there was something in his voice now, something dry and clever, that she had not expected from a man with such a stern reputation. "They work harder, they do not spook at loud noises, and they are famously stubborn, which I am told is a trait we may have in common." "You do not strike me as stubborn," Clara said. You strike me as a man who has given up arguing with anyone, because no one dares argue back. And you strike me, Julian said, as a woman who has never once in her life stopped arguing, regardless of who dares to answer. Clara felt her lips twitch. This was not the cold, dutiful stranger she had prepared herself for. This was something else, something sharper and more interesting, and despite herself, she found she was leaning forward slightly, the way she leaned forward over a particularly puzzling entry in her garden journal, the way a difficult question always seemed to pull her whole body toward it. "Careful, my lord," she said. "Keep speaking to me as though I am your equal, and I may forget to be properly intimidated by you." "Were you meant to be intimidated by me?" Julian asked, one eyebrow lifting. "Everyone warned me you were a tyrant," Clara admitted, sharp-tongued, strict with your staff, a man who buried both his parents and has not smiled since. Something flickered across his face at that, quick and unguarded, gone before she could name it. "My staff exaggerate," he said, though his voice had gone a shade quieter. "I am strict, because the estate cannot survive another season of carelessness. That is not the same thing as tyranny." "No," Clara agreed slowly. "I do not suppose it is." They spent the rest of the long carriage ride trading remarks back and forth, testing each other the way two skilled fencers might test each other's reach before a real match begins. Clara mentioned her ledgers, and Julian, instead of looking bored the way most gentlemen did when she brought up her work, asked a real question about her crop yields. Julian mentioned the state of his estate's accounts, bluntly, without the shame most men would have felt admitting such things to a new wife. And Clara found herself offering a genuine suggestion about tenant farming arrangements before she even realized she had opened her mouth. By the time the carriage rolled up the long drive toward Blackwood Hall, the sky was dark, and Clara's nervousness had shifted into something else, something she could not quite name. It was not comfort, not yet, but it was not dread either. This was not going to be a marriage of submission, she thought, watching Julian's profile as the great house came into view, its windows lit with scattered candlelight against the night. This was going to be something else, a contest perhaps, a negotiation that never quite ended. She was surprised to find that the thought did not frighten her. It excited her. Blackwood Hall was larger and colder than Clara had imagined, all dark wood and high ceilings, the kind of house that had once been grand and was now simply trying very hard to hold itself together. A handful of servants greeted them at the door with candles and tired, polite faces, and Clara understood immediately, from the state of the curtains and the thin condition of the carpets, exactly how much trouble this estate was truly in. She was led up a wide staircase and down a long hallway to the master suite, where a fire had been lit and the bed had been made with fresh linens, clearly the one room in the house that someone had taken care to prepare properly. The door closed behind her, and for a moment Clara stood alone in the flickering firelight, her heart beating strangely fast. This was her wedding night. She knew what was expected. She braced herself for it, arms crossed tightly, trying to steady her breathing, trying to feel like the confident, sharp-tongued woman from the carriage, instead of the nervous stranger she felt like now, alone in an unfamiliar room, in an unfamiliar house. Then she realized with a sinking, almost comic horror that she had a problem. Her wedding gown was a heavy, old-fashioned thing, boned tightly through the bodice and laced up the back in a long row of small, stubborn knots, the kind of gown that required a lady's maid to remove properly. And in the chaos of the wedding morning, in the rush to get everyone into carriages and off toward the church on time, her maid had been left behind at her father's house, still packing the last of Clara's trunks. Clara reached behind herself, twisting awkwardly, straining her arms in every direction, but her fingers could not find purchase on the laces. She was, quite literally, trapped inside her own wedding gown. There was a knock at the door, and then Julian's voice, low and careful. "Clara, I am fine," she called back, though the strain in her voice rather gave her away. The door opened anyway, just a crack, and Julian's face appeared in the gap, one eyebrow raised at the sight of her standing in the middle of the room, arms twisted behind her back like a woman caught in some strange dance. "You do not sound fine," he said. Clara sighed, a long, defeated sound, and let her arms drop. "My maid was left behind. I cannot reach the laces. I am, at this moment, quite literally stuck inside this gown, and I refuse to sleep in it, because it is extremely uncomfortable, and I would like to breathe properly at some point tonight." For a moment, Julian simply looked at her. Then, to her great surprise, the corner of his mouth curved upward again, that same dry, almost smile from the carriage. "It seems," he said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him, "that your new husband will have to serve as your lady's maid this evening. Do you know how to unlace a gown?" Clara asked, skeptical. I know how to untangle a fishing net, free a horse from a torn harness, and once, memorably, unknot a particularly stubborn set of drapery cords that had trapped my late father's hunting dog, Julian said, moving toward her with an ease that suggested he was, at the very least, not afraid of the task. I imagine a gown cannot be so very different. Clara let out a startled laugh and turned her back to him, holding her hair up out of the way with both hands, her pulse suddenly loud in her own ears. His fingers found the top lace, and Clara felt every muscle in her back go tight with awareness. He worked slowly, carefully, each knot giving way under his patient hands, and with every inch of lace that loosened, Clara felt the boned fabric ease its grip on her ribs, felt herself able to breathe more fully. But it was not only relief she felt. His hands were large and rough with work in a way that surprised her, and every so often, his knuckles brushed lightly against the bare skin of her back as he worked. And each time it happened, Clara felt her breath catch, just slightly, in her throat. "You have gone very still," Julian said quietly, from somewhere just behind her shoulder. "I am concentrating on breathing," Clara admitted. "It has been made rather difficult this evening, for reasons that are, I think, entirely obvious." She felt, rather than saw, the huff of quiet laughter that answered her. Neither of them spoke again for a long while after that. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of fabric loosening, lace by lace, and Clara found herself holding herself very still, very aware of the man standing so close behind her, of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from him even though he was not touching her at all, beyond the necessary work of the laces. By the time the last knot gave way, the room felt charged in a way that Clara could not quite explain. Some invisible tension stretched thin between them, and when Julian's hands finally stilled, resting for just a moment at the small of her back, Clara felt her whole body go very quiet, waiting. Then Julian stepped back. He crossed the room and retrieved a heavy velvet robe from where it had been laid across a chair, and he held it out to her without a word, his eyes carefully, deliberately fixed on her face, rather than anywhere else. Clara took it gratefully, slipping it on over her loosened gown, grateful for its warmth and its coverage both. "There is brandy," Julian said, nodding toward a small table near the fire. "If you would like some. I find it helps, on nights that feel strange." Clara looked at him for a long moment. This was not what she had expected from her wedding night. Not the gown, not the laces, and certainly not this. A man who, faced with an obvious opportunity, had chosen instead to pour her a drink and pull 2 chairs close to the fire. She sat. They talked for hours. Clara told him about her mother's disappointment, about the years of being called difficult, about the strange comfort she found in soil and seedlings when people made her feel like a failure. Julian told her, haltingly at first, and then more freely, about his father's death, about the debts he had inherited along with the title, about the crushing weight of trying to hold together an estate that everyone expected him to fail at saving. "They think I will lose it all," he admitted at one point, staring into the fire rather than at her. "My uncle certainly does." "And what do you think?" Clara asked. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have never once been given the chance to prove him wrong until now." They did not touch each other again that night. But by the time the fire burned low and Clara finally climbed into bed, exhausted but strangely peaceful, she understood that something real had happened between them in that room. Not passion, not yet, but the beginning of something that felt a great deal like trust. The weeks that followed were not easy. Clara quickly discovered that the household staff of Blackwood Hall did not know what to make of their new mistress, a woman who spent her mornings in the gardens with dirt on her hands, rather than in the parlor with embroidery, who spoke more comfortably about crop rotation than about the latest fashions from London. The housekeeper, a stiff, capable woman named Mrs. Pruitt, sighed heavily whenever Clara tracked mud through the front hall, and made her disapproval known through a series of increasingly pointed remarks about the state of the good carpets. The stiff, formal dinners felt like performances Clara did not know how to give. All correct forks and careful small talk with neighboring families who eyed her with polite, unconcealed curiosity, waiting to see whether the Duke's odd daughter would embarrass herself or her new husband before the soup course had even been cleared. But in the gardens, Clara felt like herself again, out among the rows and the raised beds, with her sleeves pushed up and her hands in the cool, dark soil. None of the whispered opinions of the house mattered at all. The garden did not care whether she used the correct fork. It only cared whether she understood what it needed. She had brought with her, carefully packed in a special crate lined with damp moss, to keep the roots alive through the long journey, a small collection of rare medicinal herb seedlings, a strain she had spent 6 years cultivating, patiently crossing and selecting, until she had something hardier, something more potent, than what grew wild in most hedgerows. She believed it could be grown as a cash crop and sold to apothecaries across the county for a very fair price. If it worked, if the plants took to Blackwood's soil the way she hoped, it could bring in real income, steady and recurring, enough perhaps, to help pull the estate out of its worst debts within a few good seasons. She had explained the plan to Julian one evening by the fire, sketching rough figures on the back of an old letter, and he had listened with real attention, real interest, asking sharp, practical questions about yield and market price, and had given her a small plot of land near the old greenhouse ruins to try, along with 2 of the estate's spare laborers to help her prepare the soil. The plants were delicate, though, fussy about temperature, about drainage, about the exact angle of afternoon sun, the kind of crop that punished carelessness and rewarded obsession in equal measure. Clara tended them obsessively, checking on them morning and evening, adjusting their coverings, worrying over every leaf like a mother hen, keeping a small notebook of observations that grew thicker with every passing week. So when the sky turned an ominous, heavy gray one afternoon, and the temperature began dropping with alarming speed, Clara felt real panic rise in her chest. An early frost. If it settled over her fragile seedlings tonight, weeks of careful work could be destroyed in a single night. She did not wait for permission. She grabbed an old cloak from the hall and ran out into the gathering storm, down toward the little garden plot, already feeling the first cold drops of rain against her face. By the time she reached the seedlings, the rain had turned into a proper downpour, and Clara dropped to her knees in the mud, frantically pulling burlap coverings over each fragile row of plants, her hands shaking with cold and urgency both. She did not hear the horse approaching until Julian was already dismounting, already striding toward her through the storm, his expression somewhere between alarm and disbelief. "Clara, what in God's name are you doing out here?" "The frost," Clara gasped, not looking up from her work. "It will kill them, all of them. Weeks of work. I cannot lose them." She braced herself for him to order her back inside, to remind her that a duchess did not kneel in the mud during a storm, that this was beneath her, that the servants could handle it. Instead, she heard the sound of fabric, and looked up just in time to see Julian stripping off his expensive coat and tossing it aside without a second glance, rolling his shirt sleeves up over his forearms, and dropping to his knees in the mud directly beside her. "Show me what needs covering," he said simply, rain streaming down his face, plastering his dark hair against his forehead. "We will save as many as we can." Clara did not waste time being surprised. She pointed him toward the far rows, calling instructions over the noise of the rain, and together they worked with a kind of desperate, focused efficiency, Clara directing and Julian following, without a single word of complaint or hesitation. They worked together for nearly an hour, side by side in the freezing rain, hauling burlap and stakes, tucking coverings tight around each fragile row, the mud sucking at their boots, the wind driving the rain sideways so that it found its way beneath every collar and cuff. Twice Julian's hands closed briefly over hers as they wrestled a stubborn stake into the softened ground, and twice Clara felt the contact register somewhere far past the simple, practical urgency of the moment. By the time the worst of the seedlings were protected, every fragile row tucked beneath its burlap shroud, they were both soaked completely through, shivering, covered head to toe in mud, their earlier composure entirely abandoned to the storm. They stumbled together into the small gardening shed at the edge of the plot, seeking whatever shelter it could offer, and collapsed against the wall just inside the door, both of them breathing hard, both of them absolutely ruined with mud and rain, the small space smelling of wet earth and old wood, and the particular sharp scent that rain always seemed to leave on skin. Clara looked down at herself, at the state of her ruined dress, and then up at Julian, whose fine linen shirt was plastered to his skin and streaked with dirt from collar to cuff, and something about the absurdity of it, a duke's daughter and a lord, both of them kneeling in mud like farmhands, struck her all at once, and she began to laugh. It started small, a startled little huff of air, but it grew quickly into real, helpless laughter, and within moments Julian was laughing too, a real laugh, the kind that transformed his whole stern face into something younger, something warmer. "We look like we have been dragged through a bog," Clara managed, wiping at her eyes. "You have mud on your nose," Julian said, still smiling. "You have mud everywhere," Clara shot back, gesturing at the state of his ruined shirt. "And I believe you have lost a boot buckle somewhere in the third row." "A fair trade," Julian said, "for a dozen surviving seedlings." He reached out then, slowly, and Clara went very still as his hand came to rest against her cheek, his thumb moving gently to wipe away a smear of mud along her jaw. His laughter faded into something quieter, something more focused, and his eyes, when they met hers, had lost their usual careful distance entirely. The shed felt suddenly very small, the rain drumming steadily against the roof above them. The two of them close enough that Clara could feel the warmth of his breath. "You are ridiculous," he said softly, his thumb still tracing the line of her jaw, kneeling in a storm for a handful of seedlings. "They matter to me," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, very aware of how close he was now, of the warmth of his hand against her cold skin, of how completely still the rest of the world had gone. "I know," Julian said. "That is precisely why I am out here with you." The air between them felt suddenly very thick, very charged, and Clara found herself leaning very slightly toward him, her breath caught somewhere in her chest. She saw something shift in his eyes, something hungry and careful all at once, an admiration that went far past her looks, far past the mud on her face, something that looked unmistakably like a man beginning to fall for the very grit and stubbornness that everyone else had always called difficult. His gaze dropped, briefly, to her mouth, and Clara felt her own breath stop entirely, waiting to see which of them would close the last small distance first. But the moment passed before either of them could act on it, the rain easing outside, the practical business of getting home and getting dry pulling them both back to their feet, Julian's hand falling away from her cheek with obvious reluctance. Still, as they rode back to the house together in the last gray light of the storm, Clara found she could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her. Like she was not difficult at all, like she was exactly right. The trouble arrived, as trouble often does, in a very expensive traveling carriage. Julian's sister-in-law, Lady Vivian, swept into Blackwood Hall on a bright afternoon in late autumn, trailing London fashion and London opinions in equal measure, and it took less than a full day for Clara to understand that she had made an enemy. Vivian was clever in the particular way that some cruel people are clever, never saying anything outright unkind, always wrapping her insults in the softest, most polite language imaginable. "How refreshing," Vivian said over tea, looking at the faint traces of soil still visible beneath Clara's fingernails, to find a Duchess so unconcerned with appearances. "I do think London ladies could learn something from your practicality. How brave of you," Vivian said another time, examining Clara's simple, unfashionable gown with a small, considering tilt of her head, to wear last season's cut without a hint of embarrassment. "I could never manage such confidence. Though I suppose out here, so far from town, no one is truly keeping track. I only wonder," Vivian said on a third occasion, watching Clara return from the garden with dirt still on her hem, "whether Julian minds terribly, or whether he has simply learned not to say so. Men are so very good at pretending, when it suits them." Each comment landed like a small, precise cut, delivered always with a smile, always in front of just enough company that Clara could not respond without appearing the unreasonable one. And though Clara told herself she did not care, told herself she had heard worse from crueler tongues over the years, she found the words settling into her chest anyway, heavy and unwelcome, accumulating there like stones. Too plain, too provincial. Not the kind of wife a man like Julian, sharp and capable and increasingly successful in restoring his estate's fortunes, truly deserved. And to make matters worse, Julian had become strange and distant, almost from the very day of Vivian's arrival, as though her presence had somehow triggered it. For nearly 2 weeks, he had been leaving before dawn, the sound of his horse's hooves on the gravel drive, the only sign of his going, and returning long after dark, tired and dust-streaked, and unwilling to explain where he had been. He offered no explanation, no reassurance, simply disappearing each morning and returning each night, too exhausted for their usual fireside conversations, sometimes taking a plate of cold supper alone in his study, rather than joining her at all. Clara told herself it meant nothing. She told herself estates required constant, unglamorous attention, that a man might simply have business she was not privy to. But as the days stretched on, and Vivian's comments continued to needle at her, and Julian remained maddeningly absent, Clara felt her hard-won confidence begin to crack, slowly, the way ice cracks under a weight it was never quite meant to bear. Perhaps Vivian was right. Perhaps Julian had realized his mistake, had realized that his sharp-tongued, dirt-stained wife embarrassed him more than she pleased him, and was simply avoiding the discomfort of admitting it, riding out each morning to put distance between himself and a marriage he had come to regret. The local assembly ball arrived at the worst possible moment, when Clara's doubts had reached their peak. She nearly did not attend at all, but some stubborn, unbending part of her, the same part that had knelt in the mud rather than lose her seedlings, refused to hide. She wore a gown of deep sapphire blue, a color she had chosen deliberately because it made her feel, for perhaps the first time since Vivian's arrival, powerful rather than plain. She fixed her hair herself, chin lifted, and walked into the crowded assembly hall with her back straight and her expression carefully composed, refusing to let anyone see how badly her hands were shaking. The whispers started almost immediately. She heard fragments of them as she moved through the room, comments about her absent husband, about whether the marriage was already failing, about whether the Duke's difficult daughter had finally proven too difficult even for a desperate Lord Blackwood. She caught sight of Vivian near the refreshment table, holding court among a small circle of London acquaintances, her laughter bright and carrying, and Clara made herself look away before she could guess what was being said. Clara kept her chin lifted and accepted a dance from a kind, harmless gentleman, a neighboring squire's son, who seemed to have no notion of the tension surrounding her, and she moved through the steps with a composure that cost her everything she had, every careful smile a small act of will. And then, midway through the dance, the room went suddenly, strangely quiet, the musicians faltering for just a beat before recovering. Clara turned and saw Julian standing in the doorway. He was still in his riding clothes, dust-streaked, and clearly having come directly from wherever he had been spending his mysterious days, his boots muddy, his hair windblown, entirely out of place among the assembled silks and pressed coats. And yet his eyes swept across the crowded room with an intensity that silenced every conversation in his path, as though his very presence demanded the room's full attention. Vivian moved toward him immediately, already speaking, already reaching for his arm with a bright, possessive smile, clearly intending to claim the moment for herself, but Julian did not so much as glance in her direction. His eyes had found Clara across the room, and he walked straight toward her, past his sister-in-law's outstretched hand, past the whispering crowd, as though nothing else in the room existed at all. He reached her, just as the current dance ended, and without a word of explanation, without acknowledging the stunned silence around them, or the dozens of eyes now fixed on the two of them, he held out his hand. "May I have this dance?" Clara's heart was pounding so hard, she could barely hear the music start. She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her into position, closer than propriety strictly allowed, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, even through the dust and travel still clinging to his coat, his other hand settling at her waist, with a firm, certain pressure that made her breath catch. "You have been avoiding me," Clara said quietly as they began to move. "I have been building you something," Julian said, his eyes never leaving her face, dark with an intensity that made her pulse race. "I will explain everything, tonight, if you will let me." Whatever doubt Clara had carried into that ballroom seemed to dissolve entirely under the weight of his gaze, under the certainty in his voice, under the way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist, as though he could not bear to let even an inch of space remain between them. They moved together through the rest of the dance in near silence, but it was not the strained silence of strangers. It was something else entirely, something that made every watching eye in the room feel suddenly irrelevant. By the time the music ended, Vivian's sharp comments and the crowd's cruel whispers felt very far away indeed. Julian did not let go of her hand when the dance ended. Instead, he led her straight through the crowded ballroom, ignoring Vivian's sharp voice calling after him, ignoring the curious eyes that followed their path to the door, and out into the cool night air of the estate grounds. They walked in silence for several minutes, down a path Clara did not recognize, moving away from the noise and light of the assembly hall and toward a dark shape rising against the night sky, some distance from the main house. As they drew closer, Clara realized it was a building she had never seen before, tall and elegant, its walls made almost entirely of glass, catching and scattering the pale moonlight in 100 directions. "What is this?" she whispered. Julian did not answer with words. He simply pushed open the door and led her inside. The air within was warm, carefully controlled, and the moonlight filtering down through the glass panes above illuminated row after row of raised planting beds, empty now, but clearly, meticulously prepared, along with careful irrigation channels and a small stove designed to keep the space heated through even the coldest months. "I have been overseeing its construction," Julian said quietly, watching her face as she took in the space around them. "For the last month, every morning, before dawn, riding out to meet with the builders, to check the glasswork, to make certain everything would be ready in time. That is where I have been. That is why I have been so distant. I wanted it finished before I told you." Clara turned in a slow circle, taking in the full scope of what stood before her, an entire glasshouse, built specifically, deliberately, for her seedlings, for her work that everyone else in this world had always dismissed as unbecoming of a lady. Tears rose in her eyes before she could stop them. "I thought you were ashamed of me," she said, her voice breaking. "Vivian said such things, and you were gone so often, and I truly believed you had realized your mistake, that you regretted marrying someone so plain, so provincial. Clara." Julian's voice was rough, almost pained. and he closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hands coming up to frame her face, tilting it up toward his own, his thumbs brushing gently at the tears on her cheeks. "Look at me. I am going to say this only once, so that you understand it completely, and never doubt it again." She looked at him. His gray eyes, always so carefully composed, so unreadable, were open now in a way she had never seen before, stripped of every careful wall he usually kept in place. "I have never once been ashamed of you," he said. "Not for a single moment. I built you a glass house in secret because I wanted, desperately, to give you something worthy of everything you are. Your mind, your stubbornness, the way you knelt in the mud rather than lose something you cared about. I admired you long before that carriage ride home from our wedding, Clara. I had heard whispers of the Duke's difficult daughter for years, and every single thing I heard only made me want to meet you more. Julian, I stayed away," he continued, his thumb tracing gently along her cheekbone, "because I was afraid that what I felt for you was too much, too soon, that I would frighten you or push you before you were ready to want the same thing I wanted. I have been consumed by you since the moment you called yourself a prize mare in that carriage and then argued with me about it for the next 3 hours." Clara let out a laugh that was half a sob, and Julian's expression softened even further, something raw and open moving across his face. "I do not want distance between us anymore," he said, his voice dropping lower, rougher. "I do not want careful walls, or unspoken feelings, or 2 people politely sharing a house while pretending they do not want each other completely. I want you, Clara, all of you, the ledgers, the mud, the sharp tongue, every difficult, brilliant piece of you." He was close enough now that Clara could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see every fleck of color in his eyes and the pale moonlight streaming down through the glass above them. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could feel it. "I want that too," she whispered. "I have wanted that for longer than I have been willing to admit." Julian's hand slid from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, his fingers threading gently into her hair, and he leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to step back, every chance to stop him. She did not move away. Instead, she rose up onto her toes to close the last small distance herself, and when his mouth finally met hers, it was not tentative at all. It was searching, and it was hungry, and it was months of careful distance finally, completely breaking apart. His arms came around her fully, pulling her flush against him, and Clara's hands found the front of his still dust-streaked riding coat, gripping the fabric as though she might otherwise lose her footing entirely. The kiss deepened slowly, gently at first, and then with a rising, unhurried intensity, his mouth moving against hers with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, as though he intended to memorize this exact moment, this exact feeling, and keep it somewhere close for the rest of his life. Clara felt herself melting into him, every doubt Vivian had planted, every fear that had crept into her chest during his weeks of absence, dissolving completely under the slow, certain press of his mouth against hers. When he finally, reluctantly, drew back, both of them breathing unevenly, his forehead came to rest gently against hers, his hands still cradling the back of her neck, as though he could not quite bring himself to let go. "There," he murmured, a real, unguarded smile spreading slowly across his face. "Now you know precisely how I feel, and there is no room left for any doubt at all." Clara laughed softly, tears still clinging to her lashes, but this time, they were tears of a very different kind entirely. Around them, the glass house stood quiet and complete, moonlight pouring down through every pane of glass, illuminating the empty beds that would soon hold her seedlings, her work, her whole stubborn, difficult, brilliant life. All of it, finally, completely seen and valued by the one person whose opinion had come, without either of them quite realizing when it happened, to matter more than anything else in the world. It had not been a marriage built on love, not at the very beginning. It had been built on numbers, on debts and dowries and desperate arrangements between 2 families who needed something from each other, sealed by solicitors' letters, and a dowry too generous to refuse. But standing there in the moonlight, wrapped in his arms, the glass house quiet and glowing around them, Clara understood that what had grown between them over these past months was something far stronger than the arrangement that had first brought them together, something neither dowry nor debt had ever been able to buy. It was respect, earned in a carriage full of clever, sharp-edged conversation. It was trust, built by firelight over careful, honest words. It was admiration, forged in mud and rain, and the fierce protection of something fragile and worth saving. And now, finally, standing together beneath a glass house built entirely out of quiet, devoted love, It was something that felt, at long last, exactly like home. If you enjoyed this and found yourself swept away by Clara and Julian's journey, don't let the story end here. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next unforgettable historical romance. We bring new timeless love stories, rich with emotion, mystery, and unforgettable characters, every week. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.